This is the IVJ podcast for the week of Monday, February the 3rd, 2025, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Folks who have lived in Indy for at least a couple decades remember when it seemed like you couldn't go more than a few miles down the road without seeing a Marsh Supermarket. Founded in central Indiana, the chain at its peak operated well over 100 stores with a critical mass in the 9-county Indianapolis metro area. In fact, it had the dominant market share among groceries in the Indy area. In 2017, 11 years after a private equity firm took ownership, just 63 stores remained. Marsh declared bankruptcy in May 2017. From those 63 stores, Marsh closed the majority and sold 26 to the chains Kroger and Fresh Encounters, which we know as Needlers. That left a lot of cavernous retail real estate on the market in the Indianapolis area, often occupying sites and shopping centers reserved for huge users. But today you would be hard-pressed to find any vacant Marsh stores in the 9-county area. Nearly all of them are accounted for with new tenants or entirely new developments. And the range of solutions found for these sites is breathtaking. One Marsh became a preschool, another became a church, a pickleball palace, a trampoline park, a headquarters for an IndyCar team. At least a couple spaces were split in two, making room for more specialized grocery stores. After hearing news last week about the site of a former Beech Grove marsh potentially being redeveloped for a plumbing trade school, I called longtime Indianapolis retail real estate broker Bill French. After 41 years in the market, Bill has about seen it all, and he has kept very good records on how these former marsh spaces have been recast, revamped, or replaced. So for this week's edition of the podcast, we're going to tour many examples as Bill explains the unique challenges of remaking a supermarket space and finding the best use for a particular community. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast Bill French, the executive director of the Indianapolis office of the real estate services firm Cushman & Wakefield. Bill, thanks for making time today.
Oh, yes. Glad to be here. It's an honor to be with you, Mason.
For the purposes of our conversation today, we want Bill's expertise in his chosen sector as retail real estate broker with 41 years of experience in the Indianapolis area. I invite anyone to look up Bill on LinkedIn, and you can spend the morning reading about his various awards and honors, including being a member of the Midwest Commercial Real Estate Hall of Fame.
You're so kind.
No need to explain. And his client list, which includes most of the major retailers and restaurant chains you'd find in central Indiana. I'm very grateful you could join us. Now, just to make sure folks have a basic fix on what you do, just quickly explain to us. Let's say I'm a developer who's working on a shopping center, or I've got a chain of sandwich shops and I want new locations, or I want to renew my lease. Why do I call Bill French?
Well, I do site selection work for a lot of restaurants, banks, and other operations and retailers, helping them to find new locations that fit their criteria. I also work with landlords and help them to develop shopping center properties and or lease space, which might be needed to be filled.
Let's do a quick history of Marsh Supermarkets for our listeners, maybe outside of Indianapolis. So Marsh Food Liners was founded in 1931 by Ermel, hope I'm pronouncing that right, Marsh.
Yes.
In Muncie, Indiana. And it hit a period of expansion after World War II, as you know, most folks did after World War II. Marsh Food Liners went public in 1953. It had grown to an operation of about 16 stores. It grew over the decades to well over 100 stores in the Midwest. You were saying really just before our interview, you think it might have been as many as 165.
I believe so.
They were predominantly in Indiana, but also in some of the neighboring states.
Yeah, they had some Ohio operations basically along the border.
But they were based in the Indianapolis area, I guess technically what we call Fishers.
Originally, they were kind of in Muncie and Yorktown. And then they came down and they built a new facility there at 9800 Cross Point in Fishers, once Fishers started to grow.
Is it fair to say that in the late 20th century, Marsh was the supermarket leader in the Indianapolis area market?
Oh, it's very fair. They had the market share. They had the most market share of any grocer in central Indiana for many, many years.
So Marsh had about 100 stores in 2006 when the company was acquired by a private equity firm named Sun Capital Partners. And at that point, Marsh already was under heavy financial stress due to a number of factors that would be impossible for us to get into here and probably deserve their own book. But certainly we can say the grocery business is a very low margin proposition, and the Indianapolis market has become incredibly competitive in the last 30 years. So after acquiring Marsh, Sun Capital started closing stores to cut costs. By 2017, Sun Capital announced it was prepared to close its 63 remaining Marsh stores within 2 months unless it could find buyers or business partners. It closed 19 stores in May of 2017. It then sold 26 stores to the chains Kroger and Fresh Encounter, which we know as Needlers. That left 18 stores in June 2017 that then liquidated their inventory and closed. 9 of those 18 stores were in the 9-county Indianapolis area. Now you have, unfortunately the folks can't see it, you have an amazing spreadsheet in front of you since your job is to track this real estate. Tell us what you have determined here by going over these historic records about basically the stores that were left in 2017.
We looked at some of the stores that were remaining, primarily in the central Indiana market. And, my spreadsheet has been reduced to the last 40 stores or so that were out there. But remember, we had Marsh, and we also had O'Malley stores and a number of different locations. So we just always track these because it's important for people to know where inventory is available. And Marsh had some excellent locations in a lot of markets around central Indiana, and they were at the penultimate corner in many of the smaller towns, too.
Overall, how many Marshes did the Indianapolis market, say the 9-county market, have to absorb once those locations started closing en masse in 2017?
Yeah, really kind of a swag in a way, but it's probably around 40 in central Indiana, depending on how far you want to cast your net.
At this point, are there any more vacant Marshes left?
I think there may be 1 or 2 that are still empty at this juncture. And I think there's one at 11625 Fox Road, which is on the southeast side of Geist Reservoir. It was a Needlers for a hot moment, but that didn't take. And last time I went by last month, it was still empty.
What was it like to be a retail real estate broker during this period in 2017, watching this whole thing unfold?
It was interesting because it was a transition in the market. Once Marsh said that they were going to close, you saw Kroger posturing to take a lot of the locations. You saw Needlers or Fresh Encounter posturing to take a lot of the locations. You had other people that were interested. You also had a lot of landlords that were in hot water. If they had debt on their property and all of a sudden their cash flow is gone, boy, that's a really uncomfortable situation. So there are a lot of different stories that were unfolding at the same time. Some people had Marsh credit and all of a sudden their lease became a Kroger. Guess what? Wow, they were really happy. But then there are other people who had nothing but an empty store.
How big was a typical Marsh supermarket?
That's a tough one. And maybe that was one of the challenges they had because they had such a wide variety of store sizes. In some of the smaller towns, like a Hartford City or a Tipton, Indiana, they might be at 25 or 30,000 feet. Okay, there's only so many people. But they had stores in Indianapolis ranging from 81 to 91,000 square feet. So they were all across the board. If you had to take an average, it's probably somewhere between 55 and 60,000 feet.
One thing that's a little hard, I think, for onlookers to grasp is that while I think many supermarket chains just lease the space that their stores occupy from a property owner, Marsh liked in many cases to own the actual store, like the physical real estate and land. What was the rationale for owning the land?
If you own the real estate, obviously there are some depreciation benefits, the benefits of truly controlling the property and maintaining the property to your satisfaction. As a grocery store selling food products, it has to be maintained at a certain level. So that was part of it. It was also a way to grow the asset base of the company. You could borrow more money if you had good real estate assets as part of your portfolio.
When you're looking at the potential for redeveloping a closed Marsh store, is the process more problematic in places where Marsh had owned the property?
In some cases, yes. Oftentimes we found that Sun Capital immediately sold off a lot of the owned properties and leased them back, and often leased them back at some pretty high rents. So we saw that happening. One of the biggest challenges, Mason, with converting a grocery store to alternate uses, grocery stores are incredibly unique. Think about when you go inside. You go inside and you've got the produce area where the temperatures are fairly cool. Then you go around the corner and you get into the freezer section, and even in summertime, you might want to have a coat on. The way that the heating and air conditioning systems work in groceries, it's like no other building. And so they reclaim heat from some of the generators that were used to power the freezers and coolers. And then they also had the freezers and coolers actually acting as air conditioning in some of the aisles. So whenever a store went vacant, generally the next person, if it was not going to be a grocery, needed to start over with its heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system. Because what was there wasn't going to work for the next guy.
That's fascinating. I was wondering if there was something in particular that was problematic about a supermarket. Like in the same way that if you try to redevelop a gas station site, you're never going to have an environmental remediation problem. And it sounds like if you're not doing basically the same thing, a grocery store, you just got to scrap what's ever there.
There are a lot of spreadsheets that were put together. It's like, do you keep the building or do you tear the building down? Because to renovate the building oftentimes was really close to the cost of new construction.
You touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to put it back in your ear for a second. When you were hearing from landlords and shopping center owners at the time, I mean, they just must have been in complete panic.
Some of the owners actually had Marsh in at a very low rate and almost in a sense welcomed the opportunity to take control of the space back. Okay, there was a subset of that, maybe 10 to 20% of the people out there. The other group, maybe the majority of the group, 50%, they wanted them to stay. And again, some of them were very fortunate when Needlers and or Kroger acquired those leases at the auction that was held. And all of a sudden, boom, now they've got a good viable tenant, much stronger credit-wise than Marsh. But then there were the folks that had high rents and then their leases were canceled. They were rejected during the bankruptcy process. Those people were in dire straits.
You mentioned people trying to game out the difference between tearing down a building and renovating a building. Is that work that you actually would do on your own as a retail real estate broker? Do you try to figure out okay, how do we figure out what goes into this space? Who should I try to call to see if they'd be interested in going into the space? And can I give them numbers just to get them thinking about whether or not this is going to be right for them?
One of the things we did frequently was we already had people that we knew, clients that wanted to be in a certain area. And if that marsh fit the criteria, either in whole or maybe to divide it in half, then we were pursuing the property. And frequently we would get together with some contractors and other folks to talk about how do we build a model of what's it really going to cost to fix this, or not fix it so much as to get it back to where it needs to be for the next person. And we would figure out what that cost might be and then take a look, well, how does that translate into what rent is now going to be? What's going to be the occupancy cost for the tenant? So we were building these models on a continual basis. And after you went through it 3 or 4 times, you could generally, within 5 or 10%, make an assumption of what it would be at another property.
In a minute, we're going to look at how many of the sites in the Indianapolis area have been redeveloped. Let me ask you first, has the reuse of the Marsh sites happened more slowly than you thought at the time, or more quickly, or were basically all bets off due to the pandemic?
The pandemic probably had some issues there, but for the most part, because they're so expensive for readaptive uses, that it took special circumstances and it took people with capital. There are a few people that went through the bankruptcy process and new folks came in and bought the properties and then had the capital to renovate. And that's an extraordinarily long process in the commercial real estate world. So I'm not surprised that it took a long time, especially considering these were former grocery store locations.
Let's take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ podcast in my interview with Bill French about the many ways that former Marsh Supermarkets have been recast, revamped, or replaced since the firm's bankruptcy in 2017. Let's start with some case studies here. Here's the most recent news. So a not-for-profit plumbing trade school is planning to build a 20,000 square foot facility in the 1800 block of Albany Street in Beech Grove. That previously was the site of a Marsh supermarket, which then became a Safeway in 2017, but then was demolished in 2022. I believe that site was one of the 9 Indy area stores that didn't go to Kroger or Fresh Encounters in June 2017. How does this reuse strike you?
It's interesting because it's apparent that area, that location, just wasn't a grocery store location any longer. The size of the grocery, the population had probably shifted, or not probably, I know it had shifted from that area on Albany Street. And so to see an adaptive reuse, an alternative use like the mechanical skills school going there, pretty exciting, actually.
Let's go to another school. This is my favorite, absolutely my favorite. We're going to go to Shelbyville, where a 62,000 square foot Marsh on State Road 44 was renovated for $13 million and turned into a preschool for the local school district. I think at least initially it was split between 15 classrooms and new administrative offices for Shelbyville Central Schools. What I think is kind of interesting is you can see some of the architectural elements of the Marsh kind of in the background, but the face of it is very modern and also in a weird way kind of like child friendly. I think they actually have like a little door that somebody who's 4 feet tall could go through. Have you been there? Have you seen that?
Actually, I was there 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
and when I drove by, this was before our interview, when I drove by, I just started laughing, going, God, I can't believe, I mean, it's a hell of a retail location too, but I can't believe that that's where the school district purchased and turned it into the daycare that it is today.
Is Shelbyville still served by grocery stores?
Yeah, there's a Kroger right around the corner. There's a Walmart just down the street. So I think there's ample supply.
I would assume as redevelopments go, this is kind of on the creative side of things.
Exactly. Very creative. Municipally, to think that a public entity, a school district, did this is pretty amazing.
Now, one of the highest profile reuses of a Marsh was in the Nora area of Indianapolis on 86th Street, just east of Westfield. About half of the 50,000 square foot space was first redeveloped in 2018 as an Aldi, which sounds like it makes sense. And then liquor superstore chain Total Wine & More opened its first Indiana store in the remaining 26,000 square feet. We're talking about the need for the right kinds of refrigeration systems. Was that an easy thing to do, just to like drop Aldi and Total Wine in there? Or does that need to be totally scrapped and started over?
That was really challenging. Aldi can come in and do what it does. It knows how to operate and how to renovate a building. So kudos to them. The good thing about these locations is that they have enough power, enough electricity to really run a small city. And so made sense because Total Wine could come in and think about all the coolers and refrigerators it needs for its product. And so it really made a lot of sense. Yeah, it was very costly, but that's an irreplaceable location. I mean, there's some good incomes in their area, some high traffic counts, and incredible population density. And once Total Wine opened, it was amazing. It became a little bit of a parking problem. People were coming from everywhere to go to Total Wine.
Yeah, I don't know if people remember. People lost their minds when Total Wine came in here. I mean, it was incredible. And there was a court case. I think it actually went to the Indiana Supreme Court about whether or not they could come in and do what they wanted to do. And once it worked, I think they've opened a few other locations.
Oh, they're in Noblesville. They're in Greenwood. They've opened a number of locations. And, they're a very formidable competitor. They do a great job.
This was an interesting situation in that the owner of the property was okay with just filling half the space initially and wasn't waiting for someone to come by and say, yeah, I'll take all 55,000 square feet.
It's interesting because cutting the space is extraordinarily expensive. But if you do it for the right people, Aldi was going to generate a lot of traffic, and it actually created value because there's only so many people that are going to take a really big space. But if you cut it in half, oftentimes you might have 3 or 4 times the number of replacement tenants that can now evaluate it. And so that's how it just became perfect for Total Wine.
And then something similar happened just to the east at 82nd and Allisonville. The massive Clearwater Springs shopping center had a Marsh as a 65,000 square foot anchor tenant. It closed. This was one of the 9 Indy stores that didn't go to Kroger or Fresh Encounter in June 2017. This is another instance where Aldi took, may feel like about half, but I think it was about 22,000 square feet of the space, and they committed by 2019. As a retail broker, is it harder to swing the deal where you say to a shopping center owner, look, I got someone who's willing to take half the space, or is it as you just described? I mean, that as long as it's the right tenant.
Really becomes a puzzle. It becomes a math problem. If I cut this space, can I get enough additional rent to pay for the cost to cut or demise this space? And if so, okay, does that make sense to lease half of it to Aldi, for example? And then will I be able to get a greater rent from the next tenant who's going to occupy the other half? And if you can pro forma that, if the demand's there, that's the way most of the people made it work.
So in the end, the rest of the former Marsh space was occupied by Haverty's Furniture, which I believe committed in 2022. And that space was unoccupied until Haverty's came along. The exterior of Haverty's looks great. It is very distinguished, upscale. There's nothing about it that says former supermarket, which I assume is something that's intentional.
I would say so. I mean, hey, do I want to buy my furniture at a former grocery? Probably not.
Well, they're next to Aldi, but that's okay. Let's move over to Brownsburg for a minute. HMD Motorsports spent millions of dollars to revamp a former Marsh as its headquarters. That Marsh at 843 East Main Street had been vacant since 2017. HMD bought that building in late 2022 for $3.5 million. I'm sure an IndyCar team probably doesn't come to mind immediately when you're looking for someone to buy an old 65,000 square foot supermarket.
Only in Indianapolis, and maybe only so far from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway would that be common. But when you think about the number of race teams that are on that west side in that Brownsburg area, a lot of positive synergies around that. And again, that's a really incredible adaptive reuse. You know, they are buying the property for basically $50 a square foot. I bet you they have a good $100 per square foot of additional expense into it. But I think they were able to buy that, quote, shell of the building and be able to use it and be close to where their products are going to be used. I think they're into the NTT IndyCar series and some of the other things.
And that's a situation where they chose to keep some of the Marsh architectural elements, like the slatted roof and the really wide windows. I mean, you don't have to imagine too far to go like, oh, yeah, that used to be a big supermarket.
Exactly.
Let's go to Noblesville. There was a former 61,000 square foot Marsh store at 17901 River Road that initially was slated to become a self-storage facility as part of a larger redevelopment project. The site instead became the home of a $53 million mixed-use apartment project called Nexus. I don't know how the folks out there feel about that. I assume that they're pretty happy about it. It seems like self-storage would be probably maybe one of the easiest things to do, but probably one of the least glamorous things to do.
Self-storage, a number of these were converted to self-storage. Some of them in a, quote, climate-controlled fashion, so your furniture and your belongings don't get succumbed to the humidity and the heat or the cold. But I think in that particular instance, Noblesville was focused on creating additional population density in and around its downtown. Self-storage wasn't going to do that. By getting additional people to live downtown, and I call that the downtown area, it was going to spur additional activity in the restaurant business, office space, and just, again, general population density, I think is what they were going for.
There's a trend of these Marsh sites being reused for recreation. Again, in Noblesville, a Marsh at 14450 Mundy Drive. Is it Mundy or Mundy?
Actually, Mundy Drive, Mundy, M-U-N-D-Y, was the real estate entity owned by Marsh.
Oh, really?
So whenever you see Mundy come up, that's what it translates to. That was their real estate entity where they bought property frequently, is Mundy. And so they developed a pretty big area there going from 146th Street down to 141st Street years ago. And that's where they implemented what they call the racetrack format grocery, where you had kind of a center console area where you had certain things, and you had departments which were on the racetrack going around that. A little bit of a European style.
Yeah, I remember that. I mean, that was very sort of outside the box. Like, look, everybody, here's the new way of doing grocery stores, and this is our proof of concept.
Yeah, it was a nice experiment. I'm not sure how profitable it was, but Urban Air Trampoline Park came in and did a fantastic job. They've just been crushing it. They've got a great reputation, do really well. And then the balance of the space recently became Crunch Fitness.
Urban Air Adventure and Trampoline Park. And again, this was one of those stores that didn't go to Kroger or Fresh Encounter in June 2017. It would seem to me like maybe that's the easiest way to pull off one of these spaces. It's just throw down a bunch of trampolines. I feel like maybe I'm discounting, the genius of that business.
Well, what made that particular location work was the trampoline park needed a higher than average ceiling. And most groceries might have what we call 18-foot clear. Some might be 20-foot clear, which means the crossbars and things, there's open air up to that 20-foot level. This went all the way up to 35 feet. So they were able to get the height to put in some of the contraptions that made the trampoline park work.
Again, on the recreation theme, in Fishers, the former Marsh store at the northeast corner of East 116th Street and Brooks School Road is being repurposed as a pickleball facility called 24/7 Dink.
Well, it's amazing how many people are playing pickleball these days. And they've done a wonderful job on the redevelopment of that property. When you drive by it now, you would not ever know that it was a Marsh grocery location. So they've really changed the image of the building. But the pickleball craze I think it's here to stay. And I think that'll be a good use for the Fishers folks.
Let's jump back to Marion County and talk about a particular use that we've recently seen in all manner of former retail and even office buildings. The former Marsh at the northwest corner of 62nd Street and Keystone is now the Midtown location of Traders Point Christian Church. Traders Point bought the 50,000 square foot former Marsh that was there in 2019 for $7.6 million. When you talk about dense population centers of Marion County with high traffic and relatively high incomes, that site has to be amazing from a retail standpoint. Why didn't it become another supermarket?
That's a good point. Well, Meijer had just gone down the street a couple of years prior. Everybody was putting the pressure on Marsh and opening stores. And so Meijer goes down the street at 56th Street, opens a brand new location. Kroger's up at 65th Street. And there was a fair amount of grocery around the area, but there wasn't anybody who was a clear-cut favorite to go in and redevelop that specific
There also
location.
was a Target, yeah, probably. I mean, like a
Target right there over at Glendale.
Like a three-wood away, yeah.
Exactly. Probably a one-wood for me.
I make no claim having golf skills. I just like clubs.
That was an adaptive reuse, had high enough ceilings that they could have the auditorium-type feel. It was a great, great retail location, but that was a location that was sold at a very high dollar to an investor. And the ability to redevelop that property was really challenging. The church had the right capitalization ability to come in and take things over and do what they did.
It also might be the only church I've ever seen with a bank branch in its parking lot. So there is a Chase branch, which actually moved, I think, from 62nd and Allisonville, or is maybe a consolidation of a couple different branches.
You're right. It was a consolidation of the Broderville branch, which was down at College, and also 62nd Street. So they took two and opened up one, and actually they went to a higher traffic location there at 62nd Street. And I guess nobody can say that I didn't have any money, for the donation plate.
I'm really fascinated by the trend in which commercial buildings are converted into churches and churches are converted into, for example, like shared office space? What the heck?
It's interesting. That's a whole different story that might be one for a year in the near future. But the groceries in a lot of cases, I even saw an H.H. Gregg in Kokomo, for example, that became a church. In a lot of these cases, they had high enough ceilings, ample parking for a congregation to come, and multiple access points for in and out. As it is for some of the churches, there's one at 62nd Street in Rural, just on the other side of Glendale, which is a co-op office share location. But when you think about it, it's got big open space. It has restrooms and kitchen areas and a lot of things that give amenities to a facility like that. And again, ample parking for people. So it's definitely a great conversion option for many.
You could sum up for us, what was the lesson that we learned from the sudden glut of Marsh Supermarket space that the Indianapolis area faced 8 years ago?
One of the things I would say is, to their credit, Marsh had a lot of good real estate, a lot of good locations. And when you think about how many of those locations were repurposed by groceries or other retailers, it tells you they had good real estate. So that's one of the things that we learned, that they had some really good real estate. I think the reminder was, it's challenging to convert space from a grocery to alternate uses. That's a constant reminder. If you took a former Walmart or Kmart, which was more of a general purpose retailer, that's generally a lot easier because of the way the HVAC systems were set up. But the good real estate, it leased up or sold pretty quickly.
Well, thank you for taking this trip down Redevelopment Road. For some of us, memory lane. Thanks so much for your time, Bill.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Mason.
My thanks again to Bill French. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few stories in this week's edition of IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, leaders for the fast-growing town of Cumberland, suburban enclave that straddles the line between Marion and Hancock counties, want to separate from Indianapolis government. Taylor Wooten explains the circumstances. Also in this week's issue, Susan Orr explains why Indiana has become an attractive market for large-scale data centers run by tech giants such as Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft. And Dave Lindquist pulls up a chair with Travis Moore, owner of Black Orchid Barbers, to get the story behind the local chain's growth to 5 shops, with more in the wings. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at IBJ.com. I will say it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. We're offering a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original our content is. Just go to IBJ.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.